Hello guys, and welcome to my new video. In this video I'm going to talk about permissions and runtime permissions. This will be a longer video, so I will split it in the two parts, and in this first part I'm going to talk in details about everything the regular Android developer should know about permissions, and the difference between requesting permissions on Android OS version 6.0 and above, and requesting permissions on the OS version 5.1.1 and below, as well as the difference between normal and dangerous permissions, about permissions groups and how those works. I'm going to talk also about how to inform the user about the necessity of accepting the permissions if the user has denied the access to some functions. And finally, I will talk about avoiding runtime errors when requesting permission for some hardware functionality which some devices do not have. It is very important to learn this stuff, so watch this video until the end. Okay, so as you know, the purpose of permission is to protect the privacy of an Android user. If an application needs to use resources or information, the application has to request the appropriate permission. You declare that your application needs a permission by listing the permission in the application manifest file and then requesting that the user approve each permission at runtime. This applies to Android versions 6.0 and higher. So depending on the feature you want to use, the system might grant the permission automatically or might prompt the user to approve the request. Some permissions are considered normal, so the system immediately grants them upon installation. The system doesn't prompt the user to grant normal permissions, and the user cannot revoke those permissions. Other permissions are called and considered dangerous, so the user must explicitly grant your application access. If your application lists dangerous permissions in its manifest file, that is, permissions that could potentially affect the user's privacy or the device's normal operation, such as the send SMS permission, for example, then the user must explicitly agree to grant those permissions. I'll link the full list of normal and dangerous permissions for Android OS in the description, but you need to keep in mind that those permissions could change its group from normal to dangerous, for example, in the future Android OS versions. So let's talk about permissions on Android version 6.0. So if the device is running 6.0 or API level 23 or higher, the user isn't notified of any application permissions at install time. When your application requests permissions, the user sees a system dialog telling the user which permission group your application is trying to access, and that dialog includes a deny and allow button. If the user denies the permission request, the next time your application requests the permission, the dialog contains a checkbox that, when checked, indicates the user doesn't want to be prompted for the permission again. And if the user checks the never ask again box and taps deny, the system no longer prompts the user if you later attempt to request the same permission. So even if the user grants your application permission, it requests you cannot always rely on having it. So users also have the option to enable and disable permissions one by one in the system settings, and you should always check for request permissions at runtime to guard against runtime errors. So when we talk about permissions on Android version 5.1.1, you need to keep in mind that if the device is running that version or API level 22 or lower, while running on any version of Android, the system automatically asks the user to grant all dangerous permissions for your application at install time. If the user clicks accept, all permissions the application requests are granted. If the user denies the permission request, the system cancels the installation of the application. If the user clicks accepts, all permissions are granted. If the user denies the permission request, the system cancels the installation of the application. So it's pretty straightforward here. And if an application update includes the need for additional permission, the user is prompted to accept those new permissions before updating the application. So when we need to access some hardware functionality, we need to keep in mind that not all devices have those hardware features. For example, a fingerprint reader or fingerprint scanner, let's say. So access to some hardware features as well as Bluetooth or the camera requires an application permission. However, not all Android devices actually have these hardware features. So if your application requests the camera permission, it is important that you also include the uses feature tag in your manifest file to declare whether or not this feature is actually required. And I'll as you can see here, this is the line of code that you should add in your manifest file. So if you declare Android required to false for the feature, then Google Play allows your application to be installed on devices that do not have that feature. You then must check if the application, if the current device has the feature at the runtime by calling the package manager has system feature method, and gracefully disable that feature if it's not available. And if you don't provide the user's feature tag, then when Google Play sees that your application requests the corresponding permission, it assumes your application requires this feature. So it filters your application from devices without that feature, as if you declared Android required true in the user's feature tag. So that's pretty important, because if you want to your application to be available on basically every device in the world, on every version, and on basically Android and basically on every API level, then it's important to include this Android required tag. So in some circumstances, you want to help the user understand why your application needs a permission. For example, if a user launches a photography application, the user probably won't be surprised that the application asks for permission to use the camera. But the user might not understand why the application wants access to the user location or contacts, for example. Before your application requests a permission, you should consider providing an explanation to the user. Keep in mind that you don't want to overwhelm the user with explanations. If you provide too many explanations, the user might find the application frustrating and just remove it. One approach you might use is to provide an explanation only if the user has already denied that permission request. Android provides a utility method called should show request permission rationale that returns true if the user has previously denied the request, and returns false if the user has denied the permission and selected the don't ask again option in the permission request dialog, or if a device policy prohibits the permission. If a user keeps trying to use functionality that requires the permission but keeps denying the permission request, that probably means that the user doesn't understand why the application needs the permission to provide that functionality. In a situation like that, it's probably a good idea to show an explanation and explain the user why he or she should enable it. Okay, so I'll show you the following code, which will check if the application has permission to read the user's contacts, for example. If it does not have permission, it checks if it should show an explanation for needing the permission, and if no explanation is needed, it requests the permission. Okay, so in this little code snippet here, we have one big if block, and inside this main if block we have another if block, and of course on the top we have a global variable, an integer variable, which is of value 1. This is just to associate our permission with this integer number. It can be basically any number you want, but for example it's number 1. So in this main if block we have context compat to check self permission method. So basically it's checking if our current activity has granted or have access to read context permission. And if that's true, then we are going to show this if block inside this main if block. So in the second if block we are checking, we're explaining to user our functionality or why do we need this permission. So as I said earlier, should show request permission rationale returns true if the user has previously denied the requests, and returns false if a user has denied a permission and selected the don't cast again option. So in the second if block we're checking if it's true. So if a user is denied the access and the application is requesting again that permission, then we can show this inside this code. In this block we can show let's say alert dialog or a toast message explaining to the user why he or she needs that permission. And we can also enable an option to select yes or no, and if user select yes, then we can request permission again, and if the user clicks cancel, then we can again disable that functionality. And of course in this else block we're just requesting the permission. It's self-explanatory. So what you need to note that when your application calls request permission method, the system shows a standard dialog box to the user, and your application cannot configure or alert or alter that dialog box. So you cannot change that UI of that standard box. Okay, so now I'm going to show you one code snippet for permission request response. So when the user responds to your application permission requests, the system invokes your application's onRequest permission result method, passing it the user response. Your application has to override that method to find out whether the permission was granted or not. The callback is passed the same request code you passed to a request permission back in the previous code snippet. For example, if an application requests read contact access, it might have the following callback method. So you need to override onRequest permission result method, as you see here in this code snippet. So we need to check with the switch block if request code is the one that we have passed above, and if that's true, then we will add the if block inside it. And we are checking if grant result length is greater than 0, and if grant result array index 0 is equals to package manager permission granted. So it means that if the permission is granted, then we can do the functionality inside, and if it's not, then we can disable the functionality. It's pretty straightforward here. You can understand this code pretty easily. And if a request is cancelled, the result arrays will be empty. So just so you know that. And finally, about permission groups. So the dialog box shown by the system describes the permission group your application needs access to. It does not list the specific permission. For example, if you request read context permission, the system dialog box just says your application needs access to the device contacts. The user only needs to grant permissions once for each permission group. If your application requests any other permission in that group that are listed in your application manifest, the system automatically grants them all. For example, suppose you list both read contacts and write contacts in your application manifest, and if you request read contacts and the user grants the permission, then your request write context immediately is accessed within the application. And that was it for this this first tutorial. I hope you enjoyed and learned a lot of things about permissions and how they work, and the difference between normal and dangerous and so on. So please like this video if you find it helpful. I will make another video, the second part for this, and I will show you in Android Studio with a practical example on how it works. Thanks for watching, guys. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and see you in the next video.